Looking through the incidents collectively to identify patterns, to see how we could become better or what we could implement to help us become better at reducing the likelihood of our officers using deadly force. One of the big things we did different with this 6-month review is we have actually hired a use of force expert. We will be speaking about it in a later press conference more about this individual specifically. But we have hired a use of force expert. This use of force expert will become an internal monitor to the Albuquerque Police Department who reviews shootings past the Department of Justice being here. This individual will give us a view from the outside and will not be accountable to the chief, but will report to the chief and other high-level city officials of what trends they're seeing and work more quickly in the process to identify trends and help make those changes quicker than the burdensome process that we have now that sometimes we've spoken about takes months for us to get something approved through monitors, through Department of Justice. And our hope is the faster we could correct potential issues, the more lives that will be saved. And that's why we're looking forward to some of these changes coming in the near future. It's important to highlight officers continue to encounter individuals who are armed and present an immediate threat to officers. We're reviewing 7 officer-involved shootings, and the one thing I want to make sure that's perfectly cleared, all 7 individuals were armed with a firearm, a knife, or some kind of cutting instrument. 3 of those individuals were in the process of discharging rounds at our officers, at another individual who was aggressively attacking officers with cutting instruments, and we quickly see the dangers that our officers are facing each and every day. And too many times, we see that generic labels are placed on situations that an individual is under some type of mental health crisis. But then when we get back to toxicologies, we find that that crisis was also compounded by the use of illegal, dangerous narcotics and drugs. And Gilbert will talk about last year's shootings and what we've learned. But we've learned the vast majority of our shootings, the individual is under some kind of altered state of mind because of drugs or alcohol. We actually had shootings where individuals had 3 times the legal limit in their system when they encountered our officers. It is also, a lot of these individuals suffer from mental health crisis, but the fact of the matter is, in these 7 shootings, the Albuquerque Police Department had no prior interactions and did not have these individuals in our system as somebody we had dealt with during mental health crisis. It was actually the first interactions we've had with these individuals, which makes it very difficult because we do not have the history and we do not have the information to feed to our officers, which could make the difference in some of these cases. And this is once again where I'll plead with our state legislature, our state government. We have to find a better way to exchange information between our mental health partners who are privately seeing individuals and law enforcement. And I know there's a lot of barriers to this and there's a lot of rules that protect people's mental health histories. But if they want to truly continue to reduce the likelihood of deadly force being used on these individuals, we need the help of the state legislature to ensure that the proper reporting is done so that law enforcement knows. But Deputy Chief Brown will talk a little bit more about that. At this point in time, I am going to turn it over to Deputy Chief Brown. He's going to talk a little bit about what the findings, the recommendations are from the group. We're going to talk to Deputy Chief Barker, who's going to explain a little bit about the investigations on the criminal side and how those are conducted and changes that have been made in those processes. I look forward to the continued partnership and the working with the individual who's going to be working with us from an outside perspective to bring us outside ideas. I've already reviewed some of the ideas that have been brought forth. Deputy Chief Brown will talk about some of them, specifically assigning officers roles, more active role from dispatch in a lot of these incidents. These have been found to be very well received and helped other agencies across the nation, and we're hoping that through our own initiative, we're able to discover these processes, and hopefully we could bring them over to the Albuquerque Police Department. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Chief Brown, and we'll take questions and add a little bit more as we go.
Thanks, Chief. Good morning. So, as Chief Medina said, our working group reviewed 7 shooting incidents from the first half of this year. The review found the following. So 100% of the OIS is involved an individual armed with a gun or a knife, an edged weapon. 5 of those are armed with a gun. 29% of OIS is involved individuals who are shooting at officers at the time of the incident. And less lethal force was attempted prior to using deadly force in 2 of the officer-involved shooting incidents. The working group determined that 2 of the officer-involved shooting incidents involved situations where the use of less lethal force early in the encounter might have resolved the situation, and thus avoided the need for use of deadly force. In making this assessment, it's important to note that the working group cannot predict how the individual would have responded to the use of less lethal, but it is one of the major contributing things that we're looking at moving forward through our recommendations. So part of talking about the de-escalation portion of this is we went into some of these findings and reviewed these cases. Some of these cases were still under investigation, so we didn't look at the whole totality of the investigation, which DC Barker can talk about as far as the investigation goes. Part of that is, we talked about de-escalation. As defined by APD, the de-escalation that was used in 2 of the incidents, we looked at to see if de-escalation was feasible prior to or during the actual use of force itself. We determined that it was not feasible in 4 of the incidents based on the facts of each of the cases. Determined that the de-escalation may have been used in 1 of the OIS incidents after the initial shots had been fired, but not before the second shots were actually fired. I think it's really important to note, and Chief talked about it, was the history of some of these individuals. None of the individuals that had a documented history with our crisis intervention unit. That means that they weren't on a list for follow-up. They didn't have a CIT worksheet that had been turned in, or if they did, it had fallen off and it wasn't included in the information that we knew. It's also important to know that at this time, like when officers go up to these, this is based on the information that they know at the time, like that they get from the RTCC. They didn't have any information that these people had a documented history of mental illness. Drug and alcohol use, again, this is also during the 2023 case. For this time period, it was unknown at this point because we don't have the toxicology back on those cases yet. So as far as the recommendations go, I'm going to kick it over to DC Barker, and she can kind of cover some of those.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cecily Barker. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Investigative Bureau. Like DC Brown said, I'm going to talk about the recommendations that came out of our working group. It consisted of the deputy chiefs that reviewed each and every officer-involved shooting and things that we saw and felt as though we need training on moving forward. First, APD will prioritize an upcoming firearms training that officers will be trained on environmental and situational awareness, decision-making, and threat identification during lethal incidents. There were 4 incidents where bystanders were in the vicinity of the offender during an OIS incident. 1 incident, we know that 2 bystanders were shot. APD will provide training in several areas, including, but not limited to, firearm safety rules when pointing or shooting their firearm, identifying threats and non-threats with moving targets, and overall awareness of the environments in which they may need to use deadly force. We will evaluate the assignments of less lethal tools, specifically the 40mm launchers. We recognized in the group that there were several detectives who had left Field Services Bureau under DC Brown's team and are not actively out taking calls for service. So essentially those 40mm were not being used and not accessible to the field. So we did a revamp of that, looked at where those were, and provided those tools back to the Field Services Bureau. Prioritize command and control training and scenarios for upcoming supervisor training. We're in the process of developing supervisor training that includes supervisor responsibilities during critical incidents. The training academy will include command and control training that includes decision-making and explicit assignment of officer roles. This includes communications, lethal and less lethal. We will evaluate policy for potential revision for lethal weapons deployment. The working group collaborated with the use of force expert contractor that Chief mentioned during this review period. One recommendation was for APD to evaluate its policy with deployment of lethal weapons, specifically rifles. We were seeing that several officers were showing up on scene with a rifle and not able to use other less lethal options or have that available to them. We will consider reducing the initial deployment of these rifles based on the information at the time, with the supervisor capability to evaluate the need for certain weapon types to properly address the involved individuals. We will evaluate policy for potential revision for increased roles of supervisors and emergency communication center. Chief briefly touched about this, but at communications, they have the ability to see who is available to respond to a call, what resources are available to those officers, and they will provide a more active role when we initially respond. Another recommendation provided by the use of force expert was for APD to determine if there are improved ways for supervisors and dispatchers to actively work together during calls for service, and this is what I just talked about. One thing that Chief asked me to talk about today as well is our multi-agency task force team and the changes and improvement that we've seen in their investigations. I know that Chief and myself have spoken to several of you, and we've had press conferences about the improved investigations in our homicide cases and the work that our detectives are doing. That includes the work and investigations of our multi-agency task force. A lot of those officers have a lot of time on this department, some of them over 30 years, nearing 40 years. So we have experience and expertise, but in addition to that, we need to make sure that they're receiving updated training that addresses things like cell phone usage and what that looks like on our department. These detectives also attended the Detective Academy, and they are included in the 2-day, 30-day, 60-day, and 120-day reviews. And we also continue to work very closely with the District Attorney's Office and Attorney General's Office when necessary when we're reviewing these cases. So accountability is in place, and we're seeing improved investigations. Chief?
There will always be trends in law enforcement. During the recent past, after COVID, we saw a trend in law enforcement, not just in Albuquerque, but across this country, with an increase in homicides. We're now starting to see several cities seeing decreases in homicide, an increase in clearance rates for homicides and arrests being made by these agencies, and Albuquerque is keeping up with everybody else. We've also seen an increase in officer-involved shootings. I spoke to the state police chief last week, and he spoke about the increase that we have seen across the state. And so many times these officer-involved shootings are not just a result of a police department, but they're a result of a broken system around a police department. And too many times the police department gets the blame for these shootings occurring. But I want the public to remember that we were the last individuals that were in contact with these individuals. And unfortunately, we caught them at the end of the chain. There are several places along the way that there were opportunities to help individuals get them the resources they need. Sometimes that resource may have been staying in jail. We have to shift things back to the middle where we think common sense wise, and we recognize that the right people need to stay in jail. Several of these individuals had already had past encounters with law enforcement. There was one at a supermarket where the scenario of the officer-involved shooting had unfolded months before with a different law enforcement agency, yet this individual is still free roaming the city of Albuquerque. It's no different in other parts of the state of New Mexico and other parts of this country. We will continue to be on the forefront of making changes. I want to thank the working group. I think it's very important that we recognize the working group, not our monitors, not the Department of Justice or the people that we've paid millions of dollars for over the previous several years to fix this department. Our working group identified that there was a big gap in the work and the resources that could be provided by dispatch. The Albuquerque Police Department will continue to make the changes it needs to reduce these shootings, but we will continue to put out the proper information and ensure the public knows exactly what's going on. The truth is this: since I've returned in 2018, we've had well over 50 officer-involved shootings. The Department of Justice, the monitoring team, and APD have not agreed on one of 60, of over 60, almost 60. One. I think it's important that we recognize that. But we all agree that it is one that is splitting hairs that could have gone either way. We will continue to make the improvements. We will continue to train our people to the best of their abilities, and we hope that the community understands this is the most transparent this department has been, and there are a lot of the things we're doing our first time being done by a police department, and nationwide we're respected by law enforcement community for how transparent we are, how open we are, and how we are always ready to admit that we need to make changes in order to continue to move the department forward. But we need our officers to be out there, able to protect themselves and protect these citizens, because this country is seeing higher crime rates than it's ever seen, and it's more imperative than ever that our law enforcement officers are able to go out there and do their jobs. I want to compliment the Albuquerque Police Department Field Services. Last week was a record-setting week. 168, Josh? 169 new charge felony arrests by our field officers. That is what's going to make this community safe. Us doing our piece of the puzzle, us ensuring that individuals are going through the system, and hopefully the system can provide the resources they need to overcome their drug addiction, their mental health concerns, and in some cases, quite frankly, just stay in jail. And Gilbert will talk about the drugs now.
Just real quick, here's a couple slides. So many may remember we had a press conference at the end of last year going over the 2022 shootings, and then one earlier this year when we did the review. Unfortunately, it takes a while to get the toxicology reports, and we only in the instances where someone died fatally do we get toxicology reports and can tell whether there was drugs or alcohol in the system. So we finally have that for all of the 2022 cases. If you look at 18, we had 18 total incidents. 12 of them involved drugs and or alcohol. 2 of them we know didn't involve either drugs or alcohol, and there's 4 that are just unknown. So those were people who survived their injuries and weren't tested, and we just don't know if they were using drugs or alcohol. I think we've done this in the past too, looked at back to 2018, and I think the special prosecutor here in Bernalillo County looked even back to like 2010 and determined that previously meth was involved in the vast majority of these officer-involved shootings. These individuals were of the mindset that they were suffering paranoia or thought someone was after them. Something was, their state of mind was different, and that's what preceded the officer-involved shootings. We've continued to see that. I gave you a list here of the cases and different drugs that had in their system. I think what's different this year that I hadn't seen before is the alcohol involved in some of these cases. So we have 4 cases where he had a blood alcohol level, and then 1 other who told police he was drinking before and during the incident. If you look at this, the lowest blood alcohol level was 0.19, and the highest was 0.305, which the chief mentioned. Some of these involved other drugs at the time too, but we know that they were extremely intoxicated at the time, and I think in most of these cases had access to a firearm, which led to the officer-involved shooting. So I think that's something that's concerning. We have mentioned, and the mayor did in his Metro Crime Initiative, looking at enhanced penalties for various crimes involving guns, and one of them is having a gun involved when you're drinking alcohol. It's already crime. We want tougher penalties for that. It's not just putting the public's safety at risk, but it's also putting officers' safety at risk. So just to update on 2022, and as soon as we get toxicology for this year's, we'll pass that on as well. And with that, we're ready for any questions.
Yes, Matt.
The last review was the end of the year review. It was like a little more, I think, going case by case kind of in the findings. And in here we have, determined 2 OISs were less than the 4th convenience. I was wondering, could you guys go through and tell us which OISs, like for that one, and then you got the.
Do you have the specifics?
It's in the full report that's online. I could print it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This is just kind of a summary.
Just a summary.
Okay. Second question. Have all the how many investigations have been completed in this year's OISs?
We have 9 OISs, one's being investigated by state, and I can get that number for you.
Seth will get it for you, but I think we got to remember there's 2 different investigations: the administrative and the criminal. Cecily will get you updates on the criminal, and Gilbert will get you update on the investigative. Some of them have not been through Force Review Board yet, but the investigation itself is complete, waiting to go to Force Review Board. So we'll get you the exact numbers on each portion of where they're at.
And have any policy violations been found so far?
There is always some sort of policy violation that's found. Not always, but many times there is. but the policy violation itself doesn't necessarily put the officer involved shooting out of policy, or doesn't make it that the use of deadly force was unconstitutional. And that's, I think, the key that we have to remember under the process that we're under is, was the shooting unconstitutional? And right now we have not found that any of the shootings that were during this time frame were found to be unconstitutional.
Okay, so the use of deadly force is not, all, the ones that have been reviewed have been found in policy with the use of deadly force.
That I'm aware of, yes. And if there's any change to that, Gilbert will get the information to you. Yes.
You mentioned that you hired a use of force expert. Are they hired by the police department and will be getting paid by the police department in your budget?
Yes, I think it is imperative. I spoke to Mayor Keller. He fully supports this. We are looking at 3, what we're going to call internal monitors, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. That's a separate press conference, but we want to hit the 3 key areas of the settlement agreement, and we want to make sure that when we are found in compliance, that there is somebody always internally looking at us to flag us. And that's why it's so important that this process has a dual reporting purpose, where this individual is immediately reporting to the chief and Eric Garcia, who's basically the superintendent of police reform, that they will be getting the information to quickly make changes and address issues, and that a member of the mayor's executive team will also be getting it, the CAO, to ensure that there's accountability towards the chief and everybody else at APD in making those changes. So the 3 areas that we're looking at is to ensure that discipline continues to be fair, correct, accurate, and complete, that the use of force there's a sample size also still given to the internal monitor who has no connections to the Albuquerque Police Department in their past career. And the third part is that our academy structure continues to move forward.
So they report to you but aren't.
They don't report to me.
Okay.
They report out to me and Eric Garcia, but they will not report to us. That gives them their independence. But like I said, I don't want to get too far ahead because that's going to be a separate press conference in the future.
And so where do you stand on having like a completely outside third party who's not associated with the state police or any police department here in New Mexico be in charge of looking at officer-involved shootings and use of force cases?
I think it's imperative that we get an outside view, that we get a view from somebody who is able to, and they're not going to determine whether these cases are in policy or not policy. They're going to be looking to see if the investigations were conducted properly, if the findings came out correctly. So they won't be part of the investigation itself. They will be reviewing the work of the investigators to make sure that the work was done properly. And I think that this is very groundbreaking. It's something no other agency that I am aware of does it the way we're going to be doing it specifically. And I think it's important because it gives the chief and the department a view from the outside. And I think that's one thing that for years hampered the Albuquerque Police Department, is that everything was internal. And I hear it over and over again. Well, we've always done it that way. And I think bringing in that outside view is going to be imperative. And there's also that lack of connections to individuals within the department who they may have had a previous history with, which could kind of slant their view on how things are being viewed. So I think that independent view is going to be eye-opening to us and bringing in fresh new ideas.
Are you maybe talking about the criminal investigations? Because there's a separate
Yes.
discussion on, having some kind of outside
Like a
third
third
party.
party.
Oh,
You wanna explain?
yeah, we fully support that. I think the state of New Mexico legislature needs to fund that. In order for us to have an outside entity come in and investigate, I think there's a lot of hurdles they'll have to overcome in doing so. But yeah, I fully support that. If the state could ever fund an outside entity to investigate all officer-involved shootings in the state of New Mexico, they need to find, number one, where they're going to house it, and number two, how they're going to fund it, and who's going to oversee it. Sorry about that.
Going back to the case where the 2 innocent bystanders were shot, what happened to the officers in that case?
I believe, are they all back to work? They're all back to work. They're working. The case is still making its way through the progress, and that case is still active. So it's very difficult for us to comment on, but we're waiting for the findings on that one specifically.
And then this may kind of bounce off his question, but how many cases are still being investigated by the DA or internal affairs?
The DA has a backlog of cases. It generally takes us about a year or so to get results back on the criminal investigation. So I'd have to go back and look and see how many are still outstanding, but there's not just 2023 cases outstanding, there's 2022 cases in there that are still outstanding. So the special prosecutor does a great job of communicating with us and sending us the information on the findings when they're available, but we're yet to get all the findings from every officer involved shooting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, AG Torres, he's charged a couple officers while they're on duty. Are you concerned any of these incidences or previous incidents will fall into that category?
As of now, no, but something can always change. An outside entity could find something, and I think that's one of the things that we need to really look upon, and that the Albuquerque Police Department should be aware of, and the community is, to this date, we've only ever had one officer charged with a criminal activity during the case of a shooting. That was the shooting that put us under this consent decree. And the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, they all have the rights to come and look at any of our cases, and if they see anything wrong with any of the cases in the past year or the year before, they've had the opportunity to take a bite at that apple and try to charge an officer, but we've yet to have that happen.
Can you talk about the officer shortage and if that's in any way or form affecting the number of officer involved shootings? Maybe officers are working extra time or overtime, extra hours, maybe affecting their decision making, or they don't have backup there, or?
There's always the possibility that an officer shortage could result in not enough resources being at a scene, which could lead to a variety of things. But we staff our field the best we can. We have seen increases in our ability to recruit. We have reduced the amount of time it takes for us to dispatch officers. So there are a lot of positive things that we're seeing moving in the right direction. But yes, without a doubt, a shortage of officers or officers working excessively. We do have rules on limiting the amount of overtime an officer could work per day, per week. We have to waive those rules at times, but we are cautious of that, and we do take that into consideration. Yes, Matt.
The less lethal, the 40 millimeter launchers being given to Field Services Bureau, would they ever be, was that something that was not ever really given to Field Services before?
They were, but we had a limited amount, and what would happen is everybody starts off in the field. They would get issued 40s, and then they transfer to a detective division where they have very little field use, and the possibility of using this tool was very rare. Yet we were short in the field these tools. So it's just a matter of putting a tool where it's not being utilized as much and transferring it back to somewhere where it's going to be utilized. So that's what we're working on.
So when they move to a detective, they would take the tool
They would take the tool with them,
And
yes.
now what you're doing is making sure that it stays with the field
Yes,
officers.
that we're transferring back. And we have increased. Council has been very generous with us. This administration, the mayor, we did order 40 additional launchers at the beginning of the year, and we're looking to order 40 more if we haven't already. Now this second batch, we did order a second batch of 40, but there is unfortunately a delay in their delivery, so I don't think we've received the first batch from the first half of the year.
Okay, so you have 80 on order. How many do you guys have now?
How many do you have? Josh will get that for you. Yes, sir.
Of those 7 OISs, do we know how many of those officers were accompanied by a second officer? Or?
I think all of them had multiple officers on scene. I don't recall one that had only one individual officer on scene.
This is kind of unrelated to today, but it's something you sent out before this press conference. With obviously you guys are looking for Ariana Hawkins.
Yes.
And that's something that she had an ankle monitor, it let it die, and is now, been missing for about a month now. Can you kind of react to, here we go again, another case where an ankle monitor's kind of failed?
You know, I don't know if the ankle monitor failed. There's very difficult and different situations that are at play. I spoke to investigations about this case, and this is a case where the individual had already entered a plea. And under the recommendations of a lot of different parties, this individual is key to the prosecution of the underlying charge. I've spoken with the family that was involved in this, the victim's family. I did assure them that we would get out everything we could through Crime Stoppers today, and that we would do a full court press trying to find this individuals. But we saw the same thing yesterday. It's just we have to protect the integrity of the case. At times it's very difficult, and on both of these cases, we support the fact that prosecution, the district attorney's office, did not request detention at that point in time. So without their request for detention, it'd be difficult for a judge to detain the individual, but we know the specifics of the case and we need to let the criminal justice system play its part out in both of these incidents.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Sir.